So good morning, everybody. Good morning and welcome to this very exciting first event of a new speaker series that we're offering here from the Sati Center. My name is Vanessa Abel. I'm one of the faculty of our Buddhist chaplaincy training program. And I lead the online training program. And this year, for the first time, we've had this idea to make a space here at the Sati Center for Buddhist chaplains and for conversation around Buddhist chaplaincy. So we'll be having this series for the foreseeable future. And we'll be inviting chaplains, Buddhist chaplains, people working in and around Buddhist chaplaincy to come and talk about their work, their experience, their training, the things that are important to them. And so we welcome you all to join us in these conversations. So kicking off for us today, I'm so happy to let you know that we have the Reverend Max Hokai Swanger with us. I'll tell you a little bit about Max. Max was raised Jewish and Presbyterian, and he later converted to Buddhism when he was at college. After college, he lived in a Buddhist community for 15 years, and he ordained as a Zen Buddhist priest. Later, he began training to be a chaplain. He is a former participant of our Buddhist chaplaincy training program here at the Sati Center. And then he went on to complete his clinical pastoral education as a resident for a year at UCSF. While starting to work as a chaplain, he then earned a Master's of Divinity degree, and he became board certified as a chaplain. Prior to serving at his current job at the Santa Clara Valley Medical Center, he worked at the Stanford Children's Hospital and the Vitas, VITAS hospice for 3 years. In addition to being a chaplain at Valley Medical, Max also provides Buddhist ministry and teachings, and he lives with his wife, Katie, in the San Francisco Bay Area. So Max, without further ado, nice to see you this morning.
Nice to see you. Nice to see everybody. Let me try to get my slides going, and then good morning or good day. I guess people are zooming in from other places. It's a nice, beautiful morning here in Santa Cruz, California. And Vanessa, thanks for the introduction. My sister saw my bio and reminded me that my grandmother was Lutheran, but I tend to think of it as Presbyterian because when she came, we would go to the Presbyterian church. So I do have some Christian and Jewish background, but in general, not religious, not a religious family. I'm the only one who became interested in religion. Couple things this talk, I will talk a little bit about my journey to becoming a Buddhist. I'll also then talk about the Sati program and clinical pastoral training and my current work, and also talk about ongoing training. And like as Vanessa was saying, you see my name there with the letters. Not doing that to be pretentious, but because in our field, I want to talk about things that are helpful for us as chaplains. So, for example, the MDiv, getting a Master's of Divinity is helpful, and becoming board certified is as well, but not necessary to work as a chaplain. I had neither of those degrees when I started in hospice. And ordination is also not necessary, but can be helpful. So I wanted to start out with a reflection. So as chaplains, working as chaplains, often if you're leading a group I work in a hospital. So if I'm going to start, say, with the palliative care group, I'll have a reflection in the beginning and often something at the end as well. This reflection I picked has to do with the Buddha. As you can see, Buddha's there with a sick monk, and has to do with chaplaincy. So one day the Buddha was visiting a monastery, and he came across a room where a monk was in pain and was sick. Although there were many other monks at the monastery, not one of them was concerned with their sick brother. The Buddha, beholding this woeful situation, began to look after the suffering monk. He called Ananda. I think Ananda's there in the photo as well. That was his cousin and assistant, as many of you may know. And they bathed the monk, changed his dirty bed, and eased his pain. The Buddha admonished the monks of the monastery for their neglect and encouraged them to nurse the sick and care for the suffering. He concluded by saying, "Whosoever serves the sick and suffering serves me." So whosoever serves the sick and suffering serves me. So my Buddhist journey began in college, my freshman year. I was around 18 years old. Was adjusting to being a freshman in college and having, some anxiety and trouble studying, and was introduced to yoga, which was helpful. And I was also introduced to MBSR, which many of you know is mindfulness-based stress reduction. I learned this at a hospital and was taught by a doctor. And MBSR, as some of you may know, I think was developed by John Kabat-Zinn, who is a practicing Buddhist, but is not necessarily Buddhism. It's taught in a secular way. And I remember the big teaching for me there was, the first thing they put on the board was there's pain and there's suffering. And we can't avoid pain, but we can avoid some sufferings. Many of you probably know about the second arrow. We get one arrow can hit us and we're sick. And instead of just trying to get better, we put another arrow into ourselves, wondering, how long will I be sick? How did I get sick? When will this end? We add to our pain with suffering. So MBSR was the beginning of these learnings. And in some ways, it was a gateway to Buddhism for me. I then was given a book by Pema Chodron called The Wisdom of No Escape. And I really liked that title because knowing from whenever I have anxiety, there's that feeling of fight or flight or wanting to escape, and learning that we can sit with whatever is coming up. As Buddhists, we can sit with our pain, we can sit with our anxiety, we can sit with that second arrow as well, and we can watch those thoughts go by. One thing we learn out here in California, I learned this in junior guards and as a surfer, is if a big wave is coming at you in the ocean and let's say you're surfing and it's outside and it's going to break on your head, that's very scary. But what we learn is you can actually go underneath the wave. In the same way, we can let our thoughts go by. So in my Tibetan Buddhist study, I'm learning about that, beginning to learn to meditate, learning the teachings of karma and rebirth. And for me, I really connected to Buddhism for whatever reason. And so much that I wanted to go to Nepal to study, and actually had a ticket to Bangkok. But then I found Zen Center in the Bay Area, San Francisco Zen Center, and ended up at Tassajara. So this slide has Green Gulch Farm Zen Center, which is part of San Francisco Zen Center. Consists of Green Gulch Farm, Tassajara, and City Center in the city. I spent 3 years at Tassajara and 5 years at Green Gulch Farm, and I think half a year at City Center. And I bring this up because in this way, I was training to be a Buddhist priest, a Zen Buddhist priest. I know some people here on the call might be secular Buddhists. They might be in the mindfulness tradition. For me, and I'll get to that in the next slide, I did study mindfulness as well. But having a base in religious training has been helpful for me as a chaplain, base in ceremony and practicing in more of a religious setup with priests and lay people and incense and robes, things like that. I sewed my robes at Green Gulch. That took a year. I said Namo Kie Butsu. I took refuge in Buddha in every stitch. Next, after I left Green Gulch, I went to Spirit Rock and became a vegetarian cook there for 5 years. I loved working there. I was able to sit many retreats. I sat a couple month-long retreats, which if you have time, I recommend. If you're in the insight tradition, that to me was an amazing change from the Zen tradition to have a longer sitting time and the style of Vipassana of actively noticing thoughts. Sometimes with Zen, it's concentration, more of a shamatha or concentration practice, whereas Vipassana insight was a little bit of, was different for me in certain ways. There was, of course, concentration as well. Anyway, being there was also where I met Gil Fronsdale, and he spoke to me about the Sati Center, and I started doing the training that some of you are enrolled in this year. So I'm really happy that you're doing that. That training set me on this career. Before being a chaplain, I was, I don't want to say a Dharma bum, but a Dharma person living in, Green Gulch and Spirit Rock. And then, I knew cooking wouldn't be for the rest of my life. So I was ready to try something else. So in this slide, I have a picture of Laguna Honda Hospital, because at Sati Center, my volunteering was at Laguna Honda, which is in San Francisco. And it's a hospital, but it actually seems more like a long-term care center. I would go once a week and I would see 6 or 7 patients, and I would spend a lot of time with them. There's one patient I would spend about an hour with. I think I volunteered for, I can't remember, maybe a few hours every time I went. But I mentioned that because as I get into the different hospital trainings, if you all who are in the group are thinking about volunteer experiences, there are experiences like at the hospital I'm at in San Jose Valley Medical Center, but I believe Laguna Honda also has volunteers, and it's a good place to start in some ways because there's not trauma center. It's just a slower pace, and it's almost like visiting a nursing facility where people are there for a longer term stay. So after after Sati program, I didn't apply. So usually with CPE, you apply in the fall. CPE, for those who don't know, is called Clinical Pastoral Education Training. I highly recommend this for anybody if you want to work as a chaplain, you're going to need to do 4 units generally. So at least 1 unit. So with CPE, I did mine at UCSF. The picture on the slide here is of Mission Bay. There are multiple campuses. I was actually at Parnassus on the Hill, and I was in the neurology unit. So I did the 1-year training. You can also do one unit for, I think it's usually 10 or 12 weeks. You can also do, UCSF had an extended unit, which was from, maybe for 9 months, and those students would come in once a week and learn in the day and then be on call at night. If you have the time to do a year to do this training, highly recommended. I'll get into a little bit what it's about. A couple of the logistics I would say is, if you're going to do a year training, you can't be doing a job at the same time. You're there full time, Monday through Friday. 8 hours a day, plus I was on call for a 24-hour shift once a week. They did pay us. I'm trying to remember. I think it was not a lot, like 35 or 40,000. So in San Francisco, that wasn't really enough to live. But for me, I stayed at a small Buddhist temple and was able to rent a room there for quite cheap. I think it was $700 a month. So I was able to live off that stipend. I do mention that because it's something that you'll have to factor in. If you do a one unit, I think you actually do have to pay for that unit. So for me, it was, in the beginning, finding a place to live. I lucked out that there was a temple I could live at. And the other thing I'll mention too, so if you're thinking about doing CPE, you could apply now, although I think you're not going to have the experience that you need, and it might be hard in your interview. If you applied now, that would be to start next September. Most likely you'll apply when you're done with the Sati program next September, but then you'll have to wait a year. So that's what happened with me. I waited a year after the Sati program, and I went to Japan for 3 months to help be a teacher assistant with some students. And then I just sort of did whatever I could while I was waiting for the program to start. So I was on the neurology floor in the first week. We get to pick where, what you're interested in. Is it oncology, neurology? Is it pediatrics? You would think about what your interest is and put that in. And neurology to me was interesting as somebody who's a meditator and interested in the mind. My floor consisted of an ICU with about 8 patients. That's an intensive care unit, a step down unit, which is actually this other unit was probably more like a medical surgical unit, and then just a neurology floor unit. The neurology floor unit had people coming, who were getting ready for surgery or had finished surgery. And it also had, migraine study and sleep study patients that I would visit. So when you're in CPE, you're not a volunteer, you're actually a chaplain on the floor, but you're learning on the job. We used to arrive around 8 a.m. There'd be a reflection, kind of like the one I gave you guys, but generally non-denominational, non-religious reflection, because your group consists of, we had a Catholic priest in ours, a rabbi. We actually had, I think it was 13 people. We had 5 Buddhists, which is unusual. Chaplaincy has typically been dominated by Christians. I think even the name, chaplain comes from the Christian tradition. A lot of places, like where I work now, I'm actually called a spiritual care coordinator. That's my official title, although I do wear a badge that says chaplain because people understand what that means. Another thing I was able to do at UCSF was lead a mindfulness group for the neurology residents. If you have experience in mindfulness or leading, that's something you can do. If you're working as a chaplain or you're a volunteer chaplain, I have a volunteer at Santa Clara Valley Medical. He finished Sati last year. He was also trained as a mindfulness teacher, and he's doing a six-week course in mindfulness for the staff at the center, and it's a wonderful offering for them to be able to spend half an hour a week and participate in mindfulness. So being at the hospital is kind of, it's a really intense schedule. Usually in the morning after the reflection, I'd go to the floor, I'd visit patients on the floor or in the ICU, prioritizing usually the intensive care unit. In the afternoon, you would meet, often you meet with your covenant group. That's a small group of chaplains that meet together. And this group, I've never had this in my other trainings, but it's a way that they talk to you about, what you're doing well and what your growing edges are. So we are trained to actually tell each other, you know what, Max, you're not seeing this. You're blind to this. So for example, I like to talk, and in my group, something would come up and I would start talking in the beginning, and people in my group who, were people of color and they told me, you know, look, you as a white male, you have this sense of privilege. This is your, you know, you learn about your social position. And I hadn't thought about that before in the Dharma centers I was at. So learning about my social position and stepping back when the covenant group, something would come up, stepping back and letting, even if it was silent, but letting somebody else talk before myself, not realize, understanding, beginning to realize that, oh, I had always been given this privilege that, oh, I can speak first, I can get the attention. So that was something that I learned that was interesting. The other thing that happens in CPE is you have a mentor. I had Susan was my mentor for the first two units, and then Abina for the second two. And the thing that the mentor does is they talk to you one-on-one. They would go and do visits with me. I remember when I was doing visits in the beginning. So with chaplaincy, we often have to knock on doors, and it's kind of like, excuse me, like cold calls, like, hi, I'm Max, I'm with spiritual care, just wanted to check in, you know, and you don't know what you're going to get. Somebody might say, oh, wonderful, come on in, or, you know, F off, get out of here. I don't want to see you, you know. And if I open the door and people were saying, you know, I'm fine. Like, how are you doing? Oh, I'm fine. I'd say, okay, and I'd leave. But then my mentor, we were in the emergency department, and I saw her go into someone said, I'm fine. She went in, she pulled up a chair and sat down with this person, and she sat and talked with him. And I watched as he opened up like an onion, just peeling away, until 10 minutes into the visit, there were tears coming down his cheek. I thought, boy, this is the magic. This is the magic of chaplaincy, that you can sit with somebody and be attentive and say, they say, oh, I'm fine. Okay, well, tell me about that. How is that? How is it to be fine? Tell me more about that. Again, if they say something like, no, I really don't want to see you, then, you know, you can go. You know, or if they're asleep, you might not want to wake them, but maybe there's family there that you can talk to, and you can introduce yourself and provide care. So these are some of the learnings. Another thing that happened to me in my clinical pastoral training was right in the beginning, a Christian woman, exactly my age, died in the ICU. And that was, I'm just going to say, eye-opening for me, because, you know, one thing you learn as a chaplain is you learn to be around dead people, and you learn to be around a lot of grief. I know with the Sati program, we went, I'm not sure the online will do this, but in person, we went to Cabrillo College, and we saw cadavers to get sort of acquainted with dead bodies. But for me, it was very different when someone was my age. And I think she was, at the time in her 30s. And it was, I guess because somewhere in my subconscious, I just thought, oh, you know, people die when they're much older, and no, people die at all times. I see people in my hospital now dying in their 30s. I see kids die. So that's an adjustment for sure. And that's a hard one. I mean, in my CPE as well, when I was on call, there was a 13-year-old that I still think about, because I got to know him, and he'd want to pray together. And then one day he came in and he died. And I mean, it's like these things, like really even feeling that right now in my body, like that we get to know people and they die in this profession. And that's really hard. Another thing about, with the CPE is you learn to work with many different faiths. That was a change for me, having been a Buddhist and learning meditation and chanting, but then learning actual prayer. So learning how to pray in a Christian way. And one way that I do that and can show an example is, like, if somebody tells me some things like, you know, I'm not feeling, could you pray for me for my health? You know, my partner can't visit. My dog is sick right now, you know, and let's say they're Christian, you can pray in that way. You can say, you know, you can say, Heavenly Father, Heavenly Father, I'm praying for Miss Jones. She's saying right now that she needs healing and she's sick. So we're praying for her healing. We want to lift that up and lift her up, and we want to give strength also to her partner who can't visit right now, and pray for that. Excuse me. She's awesome. Sorry, a second. We're also praying for her dog who is ill. And we pray for all this, and we're grateful for what you do, Lord, in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. So what you saw me doing there is a Christian prayer where I actually use Jesus. And I'm okay with doing that. I get that some people aren't. And I know, for example, my Jewish colleagues will not use Jesus Christ like that. But that's what I do in some ways for Christians, or read the Lord's Prayer, for example, or Psalm 23. The other thing that happens in CPE is we work with covenant. Oh, and I did talk about the covenant groups. We work with verbatims. So that's where you go in. You probably do some of this in your Sati program, but you go into a visit, and right when you come out, you write down exactly what you remember. Miss Smith said this, I said this, that, and the learning of that is that then your group can look at what your visit was like and analyze it and pick it apart and help you with that. So one example was I sat down with a patient and they were really interested in Buddhism. And I went on talking about Buddhism because nobody, I had gone to so many visits and nobody wanted to talk about Buddhism. And my group said, hey, this visit is about the patient, not about you, not about your Buddhism. And they're right. If somebody asks me about the Buddhism, I can talk a little bit about, but well, and what about you? What is it about you that interests you in Buddhism? And how are you doing? How are your spirits today? How can I help you? Because there are people that, in their situation don't want to talk about themselves. Now that's okay sometimes too, that they might want a distraction, but just be clear that that's what they need, that they need a distraction. Sometimes people don't want to dig into how sick they are and how scared they are with their sickness. And I'm speaking from the point of a hospital chaplain, which I am, not necessarily, a military chaplain or a prison chaplain. The other thing that happened in CPE was on-call shifts. Very difficult. We'd work from 4 p.m. till the next day, 4 p.m. So you'd go to sleep in a room there and I'd have a pager on me, or if a code was called, a code blue at the hospital I am is when somebody's having a cardiac arrest. When you go to a code blue, it's a very intense experience because inside the room, the medical staff is feverishly working to revive someone or keep somebody alive. And you see the staff doing CPR, and it's not like, I'm speaking to you all if you've never experienced this, but it's different than what you see on TV where they're just barely touching the chest. They're compressing the chest down 6 inches. They're breaking ribs. The family's distressed. You're outside with the family. The family's distressed. The staff is distressed. If the patient dies, the staff, hopefully, at least where I am now, will do a moment of silence. The staff leaves the room, and guess who goes in? The chaplain goes in. And you are there with that dead person and the intense grief of that family. And I guess I know you all are just starting chaplaincy, but I'm giving it to you real. This is what happens when you work as a chaplain, and this happens in CPE. And that you have to be there with that grief and hold that grief for that family. We had we have code white at my hospital, which is a pediatric death. And we had one that I will probably always stick with me. The pediatric died, and just being with the family and their intense grief and providing the care. They were Catholics, so I did bring the Catholic priest over because they did want support from their own tradition. As chaplains, we do the best we can to support any patient from any tradition. We are, at least myself, I'm Buddhist. That's my tradition, but as a chaplain, I'm interfaith. I try to do everything I can for that patient and that family. Of course, if they're Catholic, only a Catholic priest can give certain sacraments, like sacrament of the sick. So I'll have to get a priest. But in general, we can provide care. We can do emergency baptisms for babies in the Catholic tradition. And we can provide care up to the extent of when they actually need somebody from their tradition. I think I learned a lot in that year from the patients. Patients were my teachers, just thrown into events like the person I talked about, the woman who died, who was my age. And I remember I showed up with 2 Bibles. I was kind of fumbling around. Their Christian family got us into a circle to do a prayer, just trying my best to figure out how to do a Christian prayer and how to support them. And I wasn't my best then because I was just learning, and we'll make mistakes in CPE. You make mistakes. You have a lot to learn. You have to learn that there's, Latin used in the hospital, right? You might say NPO outside the room. I think it's nos por us. It's a Latin for nothing by mouth, basically. So if someone's going into surgery, they can't take any liquid. And I walked into a room, someone said, "Chaplain, can you get me some water? I'm so thirsty." And what would you all want to do? You want to get them water. They're thirsty. But no, be careful. They can't drink, because I can't remember in that situation if I did bring the water or not. But if I did, then it's a mistake and they have to postpone the surgery. But again, CPE is a time to make mistakes. It's a time to learn. When I left CPE, that was done in September. I was looking for a job. I wasn't able to find a job right away. I was hired as in patient relations at UCSF. Patient relations is kind of like the customer service department, and they were happy to hire new chaplains because we had the skills of listening. And I was on the phone a lot when somebody got the bill for their kid or for themselves. That was so much money and being yelled at. In some ways, I felt like it was just going into the world of mad, versus chaplaincy, which is not always sad, but can be. But I did patient relations job for I think a half a year. And that was a way they were also clear that I was going to be applying for chaplain work. And I was, until I landed my first job in doing hospice. And hospice in general is a little bit easier to find a job than hospital work. I'm not sure about other kinds of work, like I say, military or there's military chaplains, there's prison chaplains. I even know there's a chaplain I met who's in Tyson Foods, if you can believe that. So a corporate chaplain. I'm not quite sure exactly what he does, but my training has been in healthcare. I remember when I was in CPE, I think it was the Army was looking for a Buddhist chaplain, and I called them up and they were ready to start training me during CPE. And I was like, so it was something, I think one of these Air Force Travis base, some base in California, but then I was going to be deployed to Germany right after CPE. And then at that time, probably Iraq or Afghanistan. And I didn't really want to do that. A military chaplain, I know you do have somebody with you at all time guarding you, protecting you, but I don't know, it just wasn't for me. I didn't want to be in that sort of situation. I know a chaplain who did go to Afghanistan and was able to do some good work for the people, but I don't know that as much. But back to hospice. So I worked in hospice at Vitas for 3 years. Hospice, and one thing that's good is they're required to have chaplains for their teams. Each team consists of a doctor, nurses, a social worker, home health aides, and a chaplain. So I had about an average of 60 patients. Now, that doesn't mean it. So first of all, half of those patients, maybe the families decline your visits. And then the other half, you do go, but I saw probably 3 or 4 people a day. When you're in hospice, you're in your car, you're driving around. It's a lot of time kind of being on your own. For me, I didn't like it as much as the hospital. I'm a community type person, having lived in community and like to be with other people. So I often did visits with the social worker so we could go and visit together. But yeah, so 3 or 4 visits a day. A lot of people would honestly have dementia was one of the diagnoses. So when you're working with someone with dementia, there's different levels. For long-term, if they have it on the more advanced, they won't even be able to talk to you, but you can still go and hold their hand, provide prayer. I say this though, because you might not feel as much coming back. And I say that because I know as chaplains, it's not like we're supposed to be in it for ourselves to get something, but we also, as our careers, it's nice to feel that we also are making some sort of impact in the world. One thing I did in that hospice was I was able also to become a bereavement counselor and work with, I would visit patients' spouses or family members if they wanted to after the loved one had died, and sit with them for an hour every week or two and be a counselor for them. And that gave me a sense of purpose. But I did like the visits, like I said, there was people with dementia's also, some people have it in a minor way. I mean, my mom was on hospice and she actually had dementia, and I'd visit her. We'd have joyful visits. She wouldn't remember though in 5 minutes what we had talked about, but in that moment we had joy. And so people with dementia can be right there present, and they can be your teachers on what it is like to be in the present moment, because their brain is not making new short-term memories. And you can also work with them on life review and talk to them about the past. I talked to a guy who was in World War II who remembers walking down and shooting at Nazis. It was a lot to take in, but I mean, these days probably is less and less people who have been in World War II, but there are people who have the dementia diagnosis who can also remember part of the diagnosis. They do have their long-term memories are still there, and that can be very impactful to sit with them and talk about their life review. In hospice, there are nonprofits versus profits. That's something to look at if you're going to go into hospice. A couple around here, I know Santa Cruz Hospice is a nonprofit, Mission Hospice in San Mateo, and Pathways in, I think they're based out of San Jose, but those are nonprofits. Hospice is a big time organization. There has been misuse in hospice in California. There's been lawsuits. Hospices get about $300 a day per patient. So you can imagine that if they can set that up, and the patient might get, visited by the chaplain, let's say once every couple of weeks, but by the nurse, maybe twice a week, a home health aide, a couple of weeks. So it's a lot less expensive to hire staff than for, say, if you have a nurse working in a hospital who has to manage in an intensive care unit, they might be managing 2 patients for their whole shift. So that's something to look at if you do apply for the hospice. Make sure that they're a valid hospice. And I have seen at least one friend get burned by working in hospice. It wasn't like a real hospice, or somebody had set it up and they never got paid, and that person is actually in court right now. So in general, I think there's a lot of good hospices, but there is some sort of misuse of that going on. So just a little putting out there, just to be a little careful. Everyone in hospice has a 6 months diagnosis by 2 doctors. That doesn't mean that they will die in 6 months. Like my mom was on, I think, 2 years. People can graduate hospice, they come off it, but the majority do die, and some die in the right away. I think my time in hospice, I did have a lot of reflections about death, which would seem obvious because I was working with death. And I think that, at least from the Buddhist tradition, maybe you guys know about Marana Sati. The meditation on death can be a very powerful meditation, because it can, if done correctly, can lead us to reflect on how great and how miraculous it is to be alive in this moment. I remember at Spirit Rock, they used to bring up a skeleton figure when we were doing death meditation. And at one time I did have that sort of insight, like, oh my gosh, if people realized, in the light of we all are going to die, and in that light, wow, look at this life that we have, look at this gift. That being said, I understand life, as there's quite a bit of pain and sorrow, but it is a gift, and it is wonderful to think in that way. So I am saying that, though, that hospice did bring to mind often death. And one thing I did a lot there was I did perform quite a few funerals. I'm not quite sure if you need to be clergy to do this. I was ordained during my CPE year, so I did, was clergy, but that was something I was asked to do. I then, after hospice work, I went back to the hospital. I worked at Stanford Children's, which I think I mentioned before, at UCSF, with the 13-year-old dying. Stanford Children had a lot of long-term care kids. I was part-time there, so I didn't often see their whole trajectory and their dying. So I sort of avoided that. I dodged that bullet in a way, but working with children, it's very special. A lot of that work is with the parents, especially if they're very young. If they're teenagers, it's sort of learning to work with teenagers. If any of you have them, you walk in the room, how are you doing? They might just say fine. They might just be on their phone, and it's a sort of a skill to see if you can work with teenagers. That was definitely a challenge there. After that, I'm at my current job, which is the county hospital in Santa Clara County in San Jose. This hospital is a trauma 1 hospital, so everybody in the area who is in a car accident or gunshot wound, any kind of thing, comes to that hospital. Hospitals, unlike hospice, have that intensity. You might be sitting relaxed in your office or doing something else, and then there's a code over the speaker, and then your system gets, your fight or flight might get going, and your adrenaline gets up because you're going to go to that situation as I described and be in a situation where somebody might be okay or they might not be, and it might be expected and it might not be. And if it's not expected, and the grief can be so intense and so raw. That being said, how do we deal with that? Take care of yourself. We learn this in CPE. I forgot to talk about that. We learn about self-care, having someone to talk to, having a group, having ways to deal with that secondary trauma. I was going to talk a little bit, I want to have some time for questions too, but secondary trauma is sort of, I've experienced that when I've gone into the ED and someone's died suddenly and they didn't, weren't expecting it. And then I have the trauma of dealing with the trauma of the parents or the people, the family members. Then I have the secondary trauma. There's also another term called vicarious trauma. And when I looked that up, it says it's a shift in the clinician's attitude and worldview after prolonged exposure to patients suffering. I'm actually not quite clear about the difference, but I would think it's more about when you've seen somebody for a longer period of time or something that happens longer. But this is a part of the job that you can have secondary or vicarious trauma. You can also get compassion fatigue. And these are things to look out for and to talk to your colleagues or friends or spouses or whoever you have about if you are getting to the state. If you are, compassion fatigue means your physical, emotional, and psychological impact of helping others. So if you are, as a chaplain, you come in and you're seeing a lot of suffering, you can get a compassion fatigue. You can get to be too much for you if you don't take care of yourself. At the current hospital, what I find is I get quite a bit of moral distress. And what I mean by moral distress is because I go into a room, we have a lot of people who are uninsured, unhoused, and I provide care for this person. And then I think there are 400 other people in this hospital who need this care. It's a huge hospital, and there's I'm there part-time. There's one full-time chaplain and another person part-time. So we are very understaffed for what we need for that amount of people. We rely a lot on our volunteers to also do visits. But I sometimes, in the field of chaplaincy, except for hospice, where they're required to have a chaplain for every 60 or so people at a hospital work, some hospitals just don't even have a chaplain, or if they do, they have one. And it's hard in that way. That's another stressor. One joy I did have at this wedding, or at this hospital, is I did a wedding. I performed a wedding for somebody who was, this couple was in their 30s. She's undergoing cancer treatment. We did it downstairs. I remember her, she came in her electric wheelchair, and we, just sort of up the aisle, and was able to, that's the only wedding I've actually performed. I can't count on my hands the amount of funerals I've performed, but I did get to do a wedding, and that was very uplifting and gave me quite a bit of joy. There is quite a bit of sadness in this job, but there is joy, and there is joy in seeing, even in CPE, seeing somebody in the neurology unit who got, UCSF has probably one of the top neurology programs in the whole planet, and seeing somebody getting a tumor removed and it's gone, and their joy and their family's joy, and then we see the opposite as well. So that's our job. This slide, I want to just talk about some ongoing trainings. So like, I think I talked about getting a master's of divinity is helpful. I worked through something called the Shogaku Institute. Happy to talk to people about it. I was able to use some of my time at Spirit Rock and Zen Center to help towards this degree. Reverend Grace Shearson put together the Shogaku Institute, and it's a Buddhist program to help get this master's of divinity in Berkeley. I realize people are from all over, but I'm talking about in our area. There's a place called Institute of Buddhist Studies, IBS. It's out of the Graduate Theological Union. It's not necessary, but it's helpful to have that degree. It's helpful if you can to be ordained, but I realize some people are in traditions that maybe don't ordain you, or they don't have that inclination, and that's fine as well. If you do go on and work as a chaplain, I would say becoming board certified is really good. If that's going to be your work, that's helpful. But being board certified, I have to do 50 hours of continuing education every year. I also sit on committees to help other people be board certified. I didn't, just to be totally candid, I didn't pass my first board. I wrote all my essays. I sat down with my first board. We had a lot of misunderstandings on the suffering of Christ and the suffering that I talked about in Buddhism. And I didn't pass. And the second one I did, though. So I did pass the second time, so I'm board certified. But I'm just pointing that out, that we are in a world, we are breaking into this world. I went to the I'm part of the Association of Professional Chaplains, the APC, and I went to their conference in Houston and spoke about Buddhist chaplaincy and mindfulness, using mindfulness as a tool with patients. But the majority, I would say, are Christians in our field, at least nationwide. It's a little bit different if you're here in the Bay Area. Some other trainings I'd recommend, I did a death doula training. That to me seemed a lot of overlap for CPE, but if you don't want to do CPE and you're thinking about a career, you could be a death doula. That's somebody who actually sits, works with a family at the time, on top of, even if they're in hospice and have a chaplain, you're there like a birth doula is there for a mom, before the birth and during the birth. You're there before the death and during the death. Other trainings are the Shiley Haynes Institute for Palliative Care is a good training in palliative care. Palliative care is like our hospital has it. It's hospice is part of palliative care, but palliative care is not always people that are dying or have a 6-month diagnosis. They usually just have some severe disease, and they, the palliative care doctors and nurses and staff, we help them just to, for lack of a better word, palliate, to help palliate their pain. And it's a great team. I'm so happy to be on that team. Another degree you could get is called the PCAHC, Advanced Palliative and Hospice Care. Or some recommendations is, I would say, learning the Lord's Prayer is good. Gil actually told me to do that, memorize that, or Psalm 23. You'll learn if you do CP how to do an emergency baptism if you're comfortable with that. You don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with. Again, if you don't want to pray, putting Christ in the name, you might not want to do that. Pray to the divine. One thing I did have to learn in CP was to try to figure out what God meant to me, because I was praying to God for people. I know with Buddhism, we don't have necessarily a God outside. Our liberation depends upon ourselves. It is our duty and our practice that, again, liberates ourselves. But in chaplaincy, we will need to pray to people and pray to God. So what does that mean? And I learned in CP, I sort of came to the conclusion that that's all that is divine. And if that's Jesus Christ as someone, that's fine. If that's Shiva, if that's when I say Shiva, because that's, one of the gods of Hinduism. And we think, when I talk to my Hindu colleagues, Buddha was one of the divine incarnations of Vishnu, one of the main gods, or the main god of Hinduism. Sorry if I'm messing that up, but my point is, having a sense of what you can pray to the divine is helpful as a chaplain, a Buddhist chaplain, because people are going to want you to pray to God and pray to the divine, and that can be helpful helpful for them. I was just looking at the chat 10 minutes. Another thing is learning to do commendation prayers. That's commending somebody. Christians, I could share, I don't have one right here, but I do, I could share one of those. Commendation is when somebody has died, a family asks you to come. If they're Christian, there's some prayers that you can actually look up or get from a colleague like me, and you commend that soul to heaven or to God or to whatever they believe in their faith. You're always champion someone else's faith. Be curious and open. Don't take rejection personally. You go to a room. I went to a room to someone the other day. She said, F you. I was like, what? The person next to her said, oh, she can't hear you. I came closer. Hi, I'm Max. I'm with spiritual care. And she literally gave me the middle finger. And she was really suffering, and she died later that night. And I don't hold that against her. I feel with all my heart and met my loving kindness that she is in a, wherever she wants to be, whether it's peaceful rebirth or heaven, whatever her destiny that she wants. I pray, that's my prayer. It is a little shocking in the beginning, though, if somebody yells at you or or does that to you. Find support as needed. You'll need it. You'll need support in this job. There's just a lot of sadness and things that come up, like I talked about, secondary trauma. Find mentorship as much as possible. If you want to volunteer where I'm at, I'll help mentor you as much as I can. There are mentors out there, and you will make mistakes. And luckily with our mistakes, it doesn't usually sound like when I've talked to a nurse before who, by mistake gave the wrong medicine and almost killed somebody. That's much different. Our mistakes, we might screw up the prayer. We might not do it right. We might, our prayers aren't usually about life or death. And we come with a good heart and a heart of kindness and love for those people. And our mistakes are forgiven. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Max. We have just over 5 minutes still. If there's any questions, maybe we have time for a couple of questions. If anybody would like to ask anything to Max.
Hi, Max. My name's Edward. It's great to great to meet you, and thank you so much for your presentation. It was excellent.
Thank you.
It's very inspiring too. I'm a hospice volunteer, and just a lot of what you said resonated tremendously. So I'm looking. I'm actually at the Institute of Buddhist Studies as well, and we had a CPE day where they had 12 different programs highlight their CPE programs, and I was just curious what it was that you use as your criteria for choosing a CPE program. So I asked some of the other students. A lot of them were location based. Some of them were, diversity of the types of patients, specifically the types of trauma wards they were dealing with. So I was hoping you could maybe talk about that. What were the criteria you used in choosing a program for yourself?
For CPE program?
Correct, for CPE specifically.
I think at that time, I wasn't partnered and I was free, and I honestly applied up and down. My criteria was as far north as Alaska and as far east as Colorado. And I actually there was a program that wanted me to come to Alaska, but I then didn't want to go up there just because I just knew nothing about Alaska and the program. And then I also interviewed in Colorado Springs, and I just felt that would have been a bit of a culture shock for me. So I think my criteria then, I whittled it down that I wanted to be in the Bay Area, just because I realized it was just the intensity of the program, and also having to move to a whole new location would have been difficult for me. But I did look for programs like UCSF. I know I just looked for programs also that were well known. But in this area, I applied for Stanford, UCSF, John Muir Hospital. Are you in this area?
Yeah, those are the exact ones I'm looking at. Stanford, John Muir. I'm in Napa, and so those are the very local to me.
Yeah. So UCSF, but I'll tell you that. So UCSF has like 13 or 15 students. So there's
Right.
more of a chance. That's so I didn't get into
It's an
Stanford, but I did get into UCSF. But Stanford only has
Right.
six students, you know. So that's, and then I can't remember what happened with John Muir, but I think I picked UCSF because I just really like that program, and I also had a place to live. But yeah, so I think that was sort of my criteria, was location, and then also like, I don't know, I really think they have a great program there, so I'd recommend that. But yeah, but definitely apply to multiple ones like you're doing.
Yeah. Okay. That's really helpful. Might have follow-up questions for you. I really appreciate your presentation today. Thanks, Max.
Thank you. Thank you. Who's next? Is it Jim?
Hey, Max. Hey,
Hi.
thanks today for the talk. Very interesting and inspiring. One question I have for you in the hospital environment, how do you find that you relate to the staff, to maybe the nursing staff in particular? Like, I've had experience in 3 different hospitals. In each one, it feels like the spiritual care department is never really that well integrated with the rest of the staff. There's always some nurses are more open than others, but there's often a bit of friction there. And then finding a way to feel like you're serving the staff. And again, it's usually, especially the nursing staff, that you find you're able to provide spiritual care for them as well as patients and families. So you maybe just say something around that.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. That's a great question. So one thing I didn't mention is in CPE, when I was doing my charting, I charted at the nurse station, crowded by nurses. And I charted there so that I was able to check in and goof around and get to know them and learn them. And then more of an informal way, provide care rather than going back to, say, a smaller office or somewhere to do my charting. So I think just my presence there and getting to know people, saying hi to people in the morning or whenever you see them, and building those relationships was helpful. And then people were more likely to open up to me, and I was able to provide care for them.
So it sounds like
Yep.
the CPE, you were in the neuro unit for a whole year, right? So you're going to get to know the staff. But say currently where you are, you're in a bigger hospital, that you're there part-time. I'm assuming you're going through all the different units. So you're not going to get to know the staff as well as you did, presumably, when you're just on one unit. Do you have a different time when you're in that environment?
Yeah. So like, for example, since I worked in pediatrics, like I know the manager in pediatrics, I go and I spend time in my day and go sit down with those people and or say hi. I go visit. I spend time in my day. I work it into my day to visit with specific people. I'm going to visit with this nurse or go to that floor and check in with people. So I think if you can work in time to actually go and build those relationships, but you're right. I don't know a lot of the nurses at the county hospital, so because there's so many units and so many places to go, but we just do our best and just showing up and making that effort and learning a little bit about someone's life. Well, how are your kids doing, or how is this going? Something like that.
Okay, thanks, Max. Appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. Nancy, it looks like.
Hi, Max. Thank you so much. You really packed a lot in. Very generous of you. So I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned, I know you can't say a lot about everything in a short presentation, but I wanted to ask a little bit more about death doula programs. From a quick glance, some of them seem to be very short.
Yeah, I think that was like a 10-week program. And I think I guess for me, it wasn't as helpful as I thought it would be, because I had learned a lot of the same skills in CPE. But if you're not going to do CPE, it could be a helpful program to learn about like things like dignity therapy, which is a kind of way of doing life review with people and raising up their dignity at end of life. There's different things. I recommend it, but I don't recommend it if you have done CPE. Let's put it that way.
Okay, great. That's very helpful. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you. So I see it's 10 o'clock. What are we?
It is. We're at time. That hour just flew by. Max, thank you so much. Sure. Really. I feel like you gave such a sort of varied and detailed account of the work that you do, and you really didn't pull any punches about the more challenging sides of it, but also reminded us that there is joy in the work too. So thank you so much. And thank you everybody for being here. All the Sati Center's programs and talks benefit greatly from donations that people give. I've just popped a little link there to the donations page if you would like to donate for today's event. And so we will bid you goodbye. Current students, current participants of the Sati Buddhist chaplaincy training from both the in-person and the online programs, could you stay on the Zoom call if you can? But everybody else will say goodbye. And in a couple of weeks, so I think 2 Saturdays from now, and that's November 4th, we will have Ayo Yetunde coming to speak to us about her work in chaplaincy. So very much looking forward to that. Thank you, everybody, and have a lovely day.